Hello, I'm Tracy Nicholas, and welcome to Folkloring. I am a passionate folklore practitioner, and to me, folkloring is more than just a podcast. It's my commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Folkloring. I'm here today with F.D. Lee, who is an author, and she's written the Pathway Trees series and also a standalone novel, In the Slip. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Sure. Before we start to get into what your books are about and your stories, how have you been folkloring lately?
I confess I haven't been creating or making anything. That's a little bit outside of my skill set, but I did go and visit our local witch.
Nice.
Yeah. So I live in an area in Scotland just outside of Edinburgh, and it has the rather dubious honor of burning a lot of women during the witch trials. I think somewhere in the region of 300 or 400 women, a
Mm.
lot of
Yeah.
innocent people, which is obviously not great.
Right.
But
Right.
we have a statue up to commemorate all the innocent women who lost their lives. And she's a beautiful statue. She stands about, I would say, about 10 feet tall. And she's reading from a book because these women were so knowledgeable. And oftentimes that's how, they got caught up into the witch trials because they were practicing medicine or herbalism. So I went to visit her, and she's always lovely to go and see.
Sure. That sounds like a lot of fun. Very interesting.
Oh,
As for me, so a couple weeks back, I went to a ritual with the friends that I go to ritual with, and at the last minute, there was no offering for the spirits. And so a text went out and said, "Can anybody bring something?" And so I said, "Well, I don't have anything on hand, but I can whip up some shortbread this afternoon and bring that." And they were like, "Yeah, yeah." So unfortunately, I was a little bit rushed and not paying much attention when I made it. And
oh no.
yeah, so I accidentally added double the amount of butter that it called for. So
Oh,
anyway,
double butter.
it was so sticky. It was so hard to work with. I didn't know what was going on. I couldn't form it into shapes. It ended up like spreading out on the baking sheet, and I had to cut them up. And they ended up being delicious. They were a little bit crumbly, but they ended up being great.
I'm
And
not surprised.
yeah,
Double butter, they're going to be delicious.
exactly. And so I'm going to another ritual this evening, and I said, "Hey, do you guys want me to bring shortbread again?" And one of them emailed or texted me back and said, "Yes, please, we want the double butter shortbread again." So I guess that's how I'm going
Oh,
to be making it that way from now on.
all your friends, you see, they know they're onto a good thing.
Yeah, yeah,
This is your life now. Double butter shortbread is now your identity, I think.
yeah. It's true. It's true. Won't even need to put the lavender in this time.
Oh, lavender as well. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was really very tasty. Okay, so let us start talking about you instead of my butter disaster. That turned out okay. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the path that you took that got you to where you are today as an author?
Yeah, happily. I think if I talk about my path that got me to being an author, I think you'll probably learn a lot about me on the way. I think it's kind of quite indicative of the person that I am.
Okay.
So, about 10 or 12 years ago, something like this, I was in a pub at Christmas time. And I don't know if you have these in America, but we have pantomimes at Christmas in the UK. Have you heard of a pantomime?
Well, I know what a mime is. I was actually, I can't believe I'm going to admit this. I was in a mime troupe in high school. Yeah, for 3 years.
Oh, wow. Okay, now I'm changing the interview. I want to know about the mime school. That sounds wonderful, the mime troupe. Well, a pantomime is a very traditional Christmas play, and it's always a fairy tale. And it has it's very audience participation. It's very, very interactive. So you have all these little, if you're an English person or a British person, I should say, and you were to say to another British person, it's behind you, they will know exactly what to do. Somebody says, it's behind you, go, it's behind you. You go, it's wonderful. They're brilliant. They're great fun pantomimes, and you grow up with them and you love them. But they're always, always, always fairy stories
Okay.
and or folk stories. It's the tradition. And so I was in this pub at Christmas time with my friend, slightly over refreshed, I will admit. And the local pantomime was the story of Cinderella. And I love fantasy. I grew up in a comic book shop, so I've always loved science fiction and fantasy. But I think when you grow up with something and you know it very well, you have an entitlement to be annoyed by it and to see the flaws, right?
Sure.
Um, and so I got very kind of agitated about the story of Cinderella, about how it doesn't make sense that she, marries this man after meeting him, once, and all the fairy tale tropes, the whole thing, she's this young girl, her only way out of poverty is to get married. She marries this man that she's only just met. Everything is orchestrated by this fairy godmother. My cat is saying hello because she finds it very infuriating as well. Um, and so I did what I think any rational human being would do with that kind of one night of drunken silliness complaining to my friend, which is I went on to do a PhD about the representation of women in fairy tales and fantasy, and to write a 6-book series on fairy tales and fantasy. So my novels, I should say, the Pathways Tree series is a series of fantasy books about fairy tales told from the point of view of the fairy godmother.
Well, now
So
that seems to be a very reasonable and well thought out reaction to that. That you're
normal, rational, measured reaction to being annoyed by something. Yeah, I'm going to dedicate 10 years of my life to writing full-length novels and do a PhD. Yeah. So as I say, I think in telling you how I became a novel, you probably learn quite a lot more than maybe I wish to reveal about kind of who I am.
okay. So can you talk about what the series and what it's about and what who the fairy is, who's the main character, and
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, no, absolutely. It would be my pleasure. So, if I may, I'm going to ask you a question in answering that question. So, you know how fairy stories always have the same characters, the same heroine, the same hero, the same basic plot structure, usually the same morality or the same morals are being told within them. But do you know why that is?
I do not.
Well, it is because, and you'll kick yourself because this is super obvious when you hear it, but it's because they are controlled by a totalitarian fairy government that needs to harvest human belief in order to power its cities.
Of course.
Of course, when somebody explains it to you, you're like, oh my gosh, of course that's why all the stories are the same. It's a totalitarian fake government. That makes perfect sense.
Why didn't I see it?
So into this world, into this kind of backdrop, we have my heroine, my leading lady, Bee, and Bee is a short, fat cabbage fairy. And all she wants in the world is to become a fairy godmother. She wants to become a fiction management executive, as they're called. But obviously, as you know, you're not going to give that kind of responsibility to a cabbage fairy. You can't trust a cabbage fairy to run a story. That would be madness.
Of course. What cabbage fairy even aspires to that?
Exactly right. I mean, come on, cabbage fairy, get back in the garden where you belong, right?
Exactly.
So exactly that. So poor old Bee, Bee's been kind of struggling against these prejudices against cabbage fairies, and nobody gives her an opportunity. Nobody will let her have a crack at a story, won't let her get near a plot. Until one day, in the middle of the night, she is picked up by the government, by the general administration, all very cloak and dagger, and she's absolutely certain that she's about to get into serious trouble because she kind of might have been doing a little bit of crime, just just a touch of crime out of frustration. So she sort of thinks to herself, oh gosh, this is it. They've caught me. I'm going to be taken in. I'm going to be redacted. This is the end of me. But in fact, what happens is she is offered a simple happy ever after story. She has 1 week to get the heroine and the hero to meet each other and then to fall in love. And B thinks to herself, this is it. This is my moment. I can show the world what cabbage fairies can do. Everything is going to go my way. My life is going to start. And God bless her. I love Bee very, very much. And she has many, many good and admirable qualities. But thinking things through is sadly not really one of them. And so she takes on this opportunity as she sees it without really considering, well, hang on a second, why is this happening to me? She's got no suspicion at all about why suddenly she's being given this opportunity. And she probably should, is what I'll say to that. She probably should have had suspicions about why suddenly she was being given this chance of a lifetime. And that's kind of it. That's sort of, I guess, if you like, that's the setup. There's actually 5 books in the series, and I'm plotting. I'd like to say I'm writing, but unfortunately, I'm still in the plotting stage for the final book, the 6th and final book in the series.
So is that the storyline of the first book, or is that an overarching storyline of the whole series?
A little of both, I think. So the overarching kind of storyline of the whole series is to do with this totalitarian government, and it's to do with stories and how narrative. So it ties in very strongly to the PhD that I did on kind of fiction and what fiction means and what fiction does to us. Mm-hmm. So the overarching story is about this totalitarian government, and it's about kind of what do you do in that situation where you have a government that through narrative control controls ideologies, controls belief, controls conception. So as the series moves on, you get into things like propaganda, for example, which is of course another form of storytelling.
Right.
But the kind of the plot of the very first book is a Cinderella story.
Okay.
So Bee's love story, the one that she has to try and make occur, is Cinderella. And of course, the problem that she faces when she finally meets her heroine is her heroine doesn't want to get married to the king. The prospect of marrying into the king, marrying into control and responsibility for the kingdom absolutely terrifies her. She's got a good head on her shoulders, and she thinks, I don't want this. Why would anybody want this, really, when she's looking at the reality of it? And B, to some extent, I have to say, in the very first book, Bee is somewhat of a villain, because for a period of time in the first book, she really doesn't recognize kind of Cindy's legitimate complaints. She's so set on, but everybody wants a happily ever after. This person obviously wants to marry this handsome man. Why on earth wouldn't she? She's, if anything, just a little bit confused or a little bit overwhelmed. She's only young. She doesn't know her own mind, all of this kind of stuff. And then there's quite a big event happens that really shakes Bee up, and she suddenly realizes, hang on a second, I think I'm the baddie. I think I'm the villain of this. And then the remainder of the book is her basically trying to frantically undo everything that she's set up.
Interesting. Oh, that sounds fascinating.
Thank you.
So this is, it really sounds like you've got a lot of sort of underlying, political things to say through the storytelling, which I think it happens a lot, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about that and about how you chose sort of the government, and considering I'm an American in this moment,
for sure.
It's all about controlling the narrative.
Well, I think so when I was doing my undergraduate degree many, many years ago, I'm, showing my vintage now, about 20 years ago, I did my undergraduate degree. And I came across Edward Bernays. I don't know if you've ever heard of Edward Bernays.
No.
So Edward Bernays was the nephew, I believe, of Freud. He was a relation of Freud. I've got a feeling he was Freud's nephew or great nephew. And essentially, what's so fascinating and so genuinely terrifying about Edward Bernays, and he's one of history's greatest villains, and half the reason he is such a villain is he managed to go through history without people really knowing who he was or who he is, which is the great success, isn't it? The greatest success you can imagine. But he essentially took Freud's kind of psychoanalysis and these ideas of psychology that were very burgeoning in the sort of turn of the centuries. This is around 1920s kind of time, 20s through 30s through 40s through 50s, and weaponized them. So one of Edward Bernays' great success was he got women smoking.
Hmm.
He was able to glamorize smoking for women because he linked it with the suffragette movement, and
Oh.
you had women with their torches of freedom. Um, and again, it's all that use. He was putting all this kind of newfound kind of understanding of psychiatry and psychology and how brains work and associative patterning and normative kind of socio-normative behaviors and things like that we were beginning to understand more of. And then he started working with the government, working with the CIA in particular, drumming up support for wars and things like that, taking away support for kind of independent nations to make it easier for America, to invade them, and banana republics and things like that. So I got interested, because the original question, was about the government, and how did I get involved in all of this? Um, I found myself, as I say, I read about Edward Bernays when I was I must have been 19 or 20 years old, and it just stuck with me. He stuck with me for forever and ever. I'm 42 now, and I still think about Edward Bernays. I bought his books. There's an amazing book he writes called Propaganda, which he later recoined propaganda as public relations, which
Oh.
is,
Wow.
yeah, really fascinating, really fascinating. So he's the father of public relations, and he coined that to move away from the phrase propaganda. Um, and so, yeah, I was just always really fascinated with the way that Edward Bernays used storytelling, weaponized storytelling. He weaponized imagery and idols and fame and role models and all of this, and kind of turned it around on people. And then when I started getting interested in fairy tales, because I started writing, ostensibly I was just writing this one book where I wanted to just pull apart the story of Cinderella, if I'm honest. It was kind of a sort of, I had a bee in my bonnet about it, and I wanted to do, rather than just sit and have a bee in my bonnet, like I say, a rational human being, I thought I'm going to write a 120,000 word novel on this thing. Um, and then I did that, and I was researching for the novel, and I found out that Cinderella is one of the most archetypal stories in human, not even just Western canon, but in the global canon. The archetype of Cinderella, you can find it in African folk stories and fairy tales, Chinese folk stories and fairy tales, Latin American folk stories and fairy tales. It's, for whatever reason, this archetype of a young girl, impoverished, and such specific details, like there's almost always something to do with her clothes, whether it's her shoes or a piece of jewelry or something like that, and the prince finding her through this item of clothing.
Mhm.
um there's something in that story that for whatever reason seems to ring very, very true for the animal that we are, for the sort of human animal, if you like. And discovering that through researching for the Fairies Tale, the first book in the series, is what led me on to thinking, hang on a second, I think I can do something with this. I think there's actually a genuine body of study here. Um, and the books that I wrote, the kind of expansion of the government and the control that the government has through storytelling, the different Fae characters and how they are either imprisoned or freed by the roles that they're given in these stories. So the Fae are as trapped, arguably, actually, as the human characters, because I have one character, I have an emo elf, I have a gothic elf called Hemmings, whom I love. He reads poetry and he's a thought smith. So he's their version of a philosopher. He's a thought smith. But if he wants to be in the stories, he'll only ever be a villain because he's got scars.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no opportunity for him to be a thoughtsmith. There's no opportunity for him to be a poet. There's no opportunity for him to kind of live his gothic, romantic ideals, which is really where he belongs,
Right, right.
because he is scarred. And if you are scarred, then you are a villain. So as I researched more, as I learned more about the way that narrative and narrative archetypes are repeated throughout history and the kind of effects on that on social cohesion and social design and so on and so forth, the books wrote themselves in a way, or the series extended itself and it became more natural for this government to become more of a kind of prime villain as opposed to the stories themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, they're quite humorous books. If I can just quickly kind of come in and add, if you look at the reviews on Amazon, there's about, I think there's like over 700 reviews on Amazon, and you'll see people say they're funny books. It's not a diatribe or a kind of academic text. They're kind of Terry Pratchett humorous fantasy. But just before people are thinking, oh my God, I can't think of anything worse to read. Yeah, especially in this day and age with everything going on, they're very light touch. They're written to be very light touch.
Okay. Yeah, I was just talking to a friend of mine the other day about this cartoon that was here in the States when I was a kid, and it was based on Gulliver's Travels. And it was a
Mm.
children's cartoon, right? And we were just remembering it and remembering some of the characters, and it was like really funny. It was a really funny cartoon. And I was thinking to myself, can't believe that that cartoon that I loved as a kid was based
Mm.
on, political satire.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. But I think, I mean, they say, don't they, that you should write what you want to read.
Sure.
And I've um I've always enjoyed my fiction with a heavy dose of cynicism or satire or humor. I think humor is my favorite. I think that, Terry Pratchett obviously was the master of this, and no one can compare to Terry Pratchett, least of all me. But you get people like Terry Pratchett who were able to write such incisive kind of social commentary with such a magnificently light touch that you're laughing, you're crying, you're enjoying the book,
Right.
and yet these kind of ideas, these messages are going in, and it gives you something to talk about when you finished reading, right? Like, isn't that the most wonderful thing when you close a book and all you want to do is find somebody else that's read it so that you can go, and what about when this happened? And oh my gosh, and then she did this and he did that. And, oh, so I try to write for people to have that experience. I'm not trying to preach at people per se, but I do think, yeah, I think those are the books that I enjoy reading. So they're probably the books that I've written.
Yeah, I mean, you want your reader to be entertained and have
Yeah.
fun. So, that makes a lot of sense. So, the other books in the series, do they explore other kind of old tropes, or is it,
Yeah.
can you talk about?
Yeah, no, you're bang on. No, you've got me bang to rights, Tracy. You know exactly what I'm about. Um, so because I have this conceit that everything is being controlled by this, the stories, the narratives are being controlled by the general administration, this totalitarian government, and my main characters obviously function in a world where stories are currency, if you like, stories are power, um, and a means to an end. That conceit has kind of allowed me to really explore lots of different genres and lots of different tropes. So the first book, The Fairy's Tale, as I say, is it's a Cinderella retelling. It's a fractured fairy tale. It's a retelling of Cinderella. But then I was able to move on to Gothic horror and Gothic fantasy. So I've got a kind of dark academia is the second book, because B goes on to the without spoiling everything, B kind of gets more sucked into the system, and she goes on to the academy, the training ground for fiction management executives.
Mm.
And so it's set in a school. So I'm able to play around with all of those kind of gothic, the turn of the screw and the woman in white, but also those kind of wonderful dark academia tropes as well. And, the fish out of water at school. She's the only cabbage fairy.
Right.
because again, who would trust a cabbage fairy with it? And it's there that she meets. So she meets Hemmings, my gothic emo elf, and Hemmings's adopted sister Choki, who is a dwarf. And she's very rah, rah, rah. I love Choki. Oh, darling, what are you doing here? Oh, my goodness, I can't believe a garden fairy has been allowed into the academy. What fuck? So she meets these kind of very wild characters, which again, you can explore. And then in the third book, which is The Princess and the Orrery, I got into much more kind of classic science fiction. So in The Princess and the Orrery, there is an orrery and a princess. An orrery is an old kind of way to track the movements of planets, and through the orrery, I'm able to have fun with kind of classic science. So I mean classic science fiction, your Jules Verne-esque
Right.
science fiction. And space monsters. So in a world that started with the Cinderella fairy tale, I'm able to bring in space monsters, and it makes sense. Like again, your listeners are probably sitting there thinking this sounds like the most bizarre trip in the world. How on earth, in the space of 3 books, can you go from Cinderella to tentacle space monsters? I pride myself that it does make sense when you do the journey.
Mhm.
It probably doesn't sound like it, but it does make sense.
Well, it's very intriguing. So
Thank you. Yeah, intriguing is a very nice word. Yeah, very intriguing, very intriguing. But yeah, so like for example, in The Princess and the Orrery, I actually look at the way that male characters are treated in these kind of fairy tale tropes, because I think, and I'm guilty of this as well, I think it's quite common to look at the terrible representation of women, because oftentimes in these old fairy tales it's not a generous depiction of women.
mhm.
But it's also very surface level. It's very easy to see, and actually, the sort of treatment of men is equally ungenerous, shall we say? But because men are usually couched in the role of a hero, it can be quite harder actually sometimes to see that. So in The Princess and the Ori, for example, sort of around the space monsters, I'm looking at yeah, the way that men are treated in these kind of, again, these ideas of these monomyths, these master narratives that pervade multiple cultures and history, arguably.
And then what do you touch on in the last two? Do you have, is the fifth book published
It
yet?
is published, yeah. So the fifth book is out. The fifth book is called, confusingly, the fifth book is called The First and Final Story,
Okay.
which sounds like it should be the end of the series, but it's not. I just, I want to confuse people. Um, but the title refers to the first story that we tell ourselves, which is that we are good people.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Mm. And the final story, which I won't reveal because it is part of the first story, is the story we tell ourselves, which is I am a good person.
Yeah, yeah,
And the final story we tell ourselves, but I'll keep that zipped if I may, because that's quite integral to the plot.
absolutely. And what about your other book, In the Slip?
Oh, so that's completely different.
Oh,
That's a real palate cleanser from the sort of fantasy. So it's a science fiction novel.
okay.
So you know how oftentimes in time travel movies in particular, so if time travel were real, I would go back in time, I would invest in Apple computers, I would invent Amazon, I would buy, Marty McFly, I would buy that sports almanac and do all the right bets and get the right lottery numbers and, all of this stuff, right, if time travel were real.
Yeah.
So my guy Kong is a trans-temporal copyright protection officer. And it is his job to make sure that you do not go back and steal the copyright for Apple or invent Amazon or whatever, whatever, whatever.
Right, right.
So it's a noir. It's a kind of detective noir, sci-fi, timey-wimey romp, I guess is the word that I would say. And it has a penguin. So it's a time traveling copyright protection officer, and features a time traveling penguin.
That sounds like a lot of fun. And definitely less serious than all of the
Yeah,
political
it's
undertones of the series.
I think so. I mean, I still have to confess it is still written by me. So, I am the author of the work, so it is arguably it still has some messaging in it. It's anti-capitalist particularly, but yeah.
I mean, I think that that's a very common thing with storytelling and folklore. There's morality tales and tales to keep people
Absolutely.
safe from things. If there's a dangerous pond nearby because it's got a lot of, growth in it and it can pull you under, then there's going to be a monster.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And there is that element of, so storytelling, we as human beings developed the ability, the imagination, if you like, that muscle of imagination
Hmm.
was developed for exactly that reason. So there's some really interesting studies, Sugiyama in particular, her study, where they look at the evolutionary adaptation of imagination and how we developed that ability so we could tell stories. So our brains, I mean, I find this fascinating. I love anything to do with the brain. I find the brain deeply fascinating. I would love to study psychology, but I don't have the maths for it. I don't have I couldn't do the math side of it. But they discovered that our brains are literally hardwired to respond to story in a way that we don't necessarily respond to rhetorical texts.
Hmm. Hmm.
So rhetorical text would be, your factual text, your newspaper. Well, our newspaper's factual anymore. I mean, that's the dystopia, isn't it? But in principle, your factual text, your newspapers, etc., etc., etc. We go into those kind of readings. So the rhetorical reading, we go in with a reasonably high level of disbelief. We're sort of prepared to be cognizant, if you like, of what we're reading. But when we go into fiction, that high level of disbelief, that's the point of fiction. If you're reading a book and you're conscious that you're reading a book, that arguably is not a good book for you. The whole point is you don't want to know you're reading a book when you're reading a good book, right? And that is the power of your imagination. That is something that we have absolutely evolved as a survival strategy, as a species. Like you say, if there's a dangerous creek or a well that's been poisoned or something like that, you need to learn, and you need to learn very quickly not to go near this thing.
Right.
And you can either learn through storytelling or you can learn through trial and error. And storytelling is much better for the survival of the species, right? It's better to learn how to hunt a tiger through storytelling than it is to, go up and try and hunt that tiger.
Right. Well, and if that's true that, we're programmed to sort of learn through stories,
Mm.
I think that that makes sense why people put morality tales in place, why people, stories are a certain way, because there was a time that getting the prince was, getting a husband was what women had to do, you know? And so it's saying this is what you should aspire to. These are the things you should aspire to. And, you get the witch out in the woods
Yeah.
eating children, and it's like, oh, women who don't do this thing of settling down, getting married, having a lot of babies, they're the witches in the woods, right? They're independent.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely right. And everything negative that comes with that is then ascribed to those people, and then that is that abscription. Abscription? Have I just created a word?
You might have.
Possibly. Abscription. It sounds real though, doesn't it? It sounds like a real word. We'll go with it.
Yes.
But yeah, that labeling, if you like, is then re-strengthened and retold and re-strengthened and retold.
Mhm.
And the danger in that is that, again, due to the evolution of our socio-evolution, the evolution of our brain, the chemistry of our brain, it actually becomes very difficult for us to separate fact from fiction. That there's numerous incredibly frightening studies that show that we learn lessons from fiction and over the course of time. So this is something called the sleeper effect. And the sleeper effect speaks to the fact that we will read something in a fictional story, say a morality story, and let's pick something really horrible. So a really awful old-fashioned metaphor, like women who are old are inherently evil, for example, which is an incredibly common syntagmatic structure in fairy tales, right? So women who are old are evil. We are exposed to that through narrative, and we may be aware on some level that we're reading a story, we're listening to a story as children, we may have that awareness. But the sleeper effect has empirically proven, that over the course of time, we retain the moral and forget that it came from a piece of fiction.
Oh.
So the moral sinks in, but whatever level of criticality you had when you were reading, which again, if we remember, you shouldn't have any level of criticality when you're reading, otherwise you're not immersed in the story. So these things, it all kind of culminates. We're kind of, I mean, bless us, as again, this sort of concept of the human animal. I mean, bless us, we're really caught coming or going with fiction. We really are. Because to enjoy it, you need to lose all sense of criticality. But that's where the sleeper effect takes hold. Because you forget, you remember the moral, you remember the lesson sinks in, if you like, but you don't remember that, oh, hang on a second, I learned this thing through, X and Y book. You're not inclined to remember that, unless the sort of antidote to the sleeper effect is you have to remain kind of cognitively, and this is the only antidote that so far has been discovered anyway, is that you have to be cognitively incredibly vigilant and very mindful and very reflective of where your assumptions are coming from, and the validity of those assumptions, which is only a good thing for people to be.
Right.
But it takes effort, and reflection isn't, I believe reflection is an inherent skill. I think it's something every human being is capable of, but like anything, it needs practice and it needs time to develop.
Right. And I think that it's a hard thing to do. It's hard to even know to want to do it, right?
Absolutely.
And then it's hard to do it because a lot of that stuff is so baked into who we are. We forget that that's not just our feelings, right? We forget that
Absolutely.
it was
Yeah.
a learned thing.
Absolutely.
I think that's why we get, like those people believing the stories of a baby eating cannibalistic cult in the basement of a pizza parlor that Hillary Clinton was part of.
Oh my gosh, yeah, 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 yeah. But the thing is that it's true, and these things are there is a correlation between how susceptible you are and your how much you believe in a just world. So
Yeah.
there's a thing called just world belief. It's exactly what it says on the tin. Just world belief. Do you believe the world is just, or do you not? Right? And people who have a high just world belief, for example, they've discovered are much more likely to think, for example, they did a story about people who develop sexually transmitted diseases, for example, things like AIDS.
Okay.
They did a study and they found that people with a high just world belief are more likely to believe that the person did something to contract the disease. They're less likely to believe that it's bad luck or a blood transfusion, or they maybe had unprotected sex once and it was very unfortunate and they were very unlucky. So people with a high just world belief are much less likely to believe that. They're also much more likely to believe, for example, that people on benefits, welfare, I think in the US,
Yeah.
benefits here in the UK, they're also much more likely to believe that people on benefits have done something
Mhm.
to have failed, if
Right.
you like. And the same with homeless people, da 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 da. The reason that they ascribe, this is Green and Brock, did numerous really interesting studies, Green and Brock. But the sort of rationale that they ascribe to this, to these people with these high just world beliefs, is because good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people.
Wow.
And it cannot work that something bad would happen to a good person. If something bad has happened to that person, then there must be something in there. And notice the language I use, in their character.
Right, right.
Which, of course, these kind of very simplistic just world beliefs, we're pre-programmed in every, almost pretty much, certainly for me, every kind of story that I was read growing up.
Mhm.
I thought I'd show you, I brought these with me. So I've got all my favorite fairy tale books from when I was a little girl.
Nice.
So this is the series. This is called the Book House series, and there's 12 in this series. I was such a spoiled little girl because my family, we had all these wonderful books. So I used to read these, and before I could read, my mother and my grandmother would read them to me, and they're wonderful, real classic old fairy stories.
Uh-huh.
And each and every one of them, I flicked through before we met
Yeah.
tonight. For me, I know it's lunchtime for you, but it's nighttime for me. And 9 out of 10 of them, wholly subscribe to the concept of a just world.
Wow.
Good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And if you're good, you expect good. And if you're bad, you get your comeuppance. The villain dies at the end.
Well, that's so interesting because it's making me think of that weird conspiracy theory that vaccines cause autism.
Yeah.
And so it's like you can't believe, like most people can't believe that an infant or very young child can be a bad person.
Yeah.
And so they in turn blame the parents for that. And they say, oh, it's because you gave your kid these shots. And I think that that is really fascinating that it transfers that way. It's like the parents are the bad people.
Yeah, yeah. There has to be a reason. There has to be a villain at play,
Right,
right? There
right,
has to be a villain because bad things can't just happen.
right.
I mean, I think, you look at certain communities, right? So, I mean, I'm not in America, I'm not American, but I'm obviously, like most of the world, aware of what's happening over there with you. And, we have similar issues in the UK. We've got a huge media machine in the UK that is set on demonizing immigrants and trans people.
Oh,
And, it's much easier. It's much easier to have a villain and to paint a villain than it is to actually address the complexities of, well, there's no complexity about being trans. Trans isn't a complexity. You're trans and you should be left alone,
right.
right?
Yeah.
But the complexities of immigration and why immigration is occurring, and the displacement of people from their original countries and how that displacement occurred. And speaking particularly as a member of the British Empire, what our role historically is in that displacement. Because, I think particularly as a British person, you have to hold your hands up to that.
Right.
But yeah, it's the just world belief, and it's much easier to believe that there's a villain. And again, to cycle all the way back, we are primed by evolution to take learning from stories, experiential knowledge.
Mhm.
We're evolutionary primed to gain experiential knowledge through narrative and not through rhetorical texts.
Mhm,
It's
mhm.
fascinating. It's all through stories. It's not through kind of your classic. I work at a university, and I'm all for education. I teach, I lecture. That is my kind of my paying job, if you like. So don't get me wrong when I say this. I'm a huge believer in further and higher education. But learning from textbooks is hard.
Yeah.
It's incredibly hard work because the textbooks are dense. They're trying to instill a lot of information into a very limited word count. And also, our brains aren't designed for it. If they wrote those textbooks as narrative stories, people would learn much faster and much quicker.
Yeah.
But that's a whole other conversation that goes, that digs into the kind of ideological beliefs of the higher educational structure.
Right. I have this great book that I've been trying to get to, but I keep having to go read books for reviews. And it's called Lies That My Teacher Told Me. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, and it's really focused on the American education system
Hmm.
and how many things that are in our textbooks have been in our textbooks for decades that are just plain wrong.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
it's getting worse, obviously, here now because they've gutted the Department of Education and
Oh, you guys have got real, like, yeah,
yeah, and so that like that early learning again, you forget that you've learned it. It's just a thing that you know.
absolutely.
In some ways, I think that we can be like we are lucky here in America. I grew up in an area that had a great education system, but there was a groundbreaking animated series here in the 70s, and it was called Schoolhouse Rock. And never heard of it. So Schoolhouse Rock was basically this animated series, and each one was only 5 minutes long and it would teach different things. There were ones based on math, there were ones based on politics and social studies and science, and they were like these really catchy little tunes.
Sounds fabulous. Oh, catchy little tunes. Yeah, there you go. It
Yeah.
sounds fab.
Yeah. And so I mean, I will tell you this. I know a couple of things. One, I know that three is a magic number, and I I can recite the preamble to our Constitution
Mm.
because of that song. And
Wrong.
if I'm trying
Yeah.
to recite it straight, I'm still singing the tune in my mind.
I mean, I have no kind of academic knowledge of music at all. I mean, maybe that's my next PhD, huh? How does music control your brain? But it's absolutely true. I mean, what music does, the way music can just worm its way into your head and trigger memories and things like that. I mean, my gosh, yeah.
It's true. It's
We had so I my vintage is Animaniacs, if you ever heard or saw Animaniacs.
yeah, yeah.
And they used to do the same thing. They would like fill songs. So there was songs about I mean it's American, of course, but there was a song about all the states in America. There was a song about all the capitals of the world. There was a song about all the like weird ingredients and things. Like I really monosodium glutamate, dehydrated calciumate and things like that. And oh my gosh, yeah, Animaniacs. I swear I only know anything about American geography because of Animaniacs. What little I do know.
Well, you probably know more about it than some Americans.
But
You know, there's sometimes people refer to sort of a bunch of states in the West, not as far as like California, but they call them the flyover states. And
oh, because you just go across them.
right, to get to California or to get back east. But I'll tell you what, I in my mind, they'll always be the square states because when they were parceling out land, it happened sort of organically in the east, and that's why you got all those weird. But as it started to get to the west, and we started
Yeah.
over, they were just like this chunk of land.
That makes so much sense though, because when you look at the map, it's very blocky, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why they did it. It was for like encouraging people to move out west, basically, and get the economy going out there. So they, you know, set up a state and said, okay, our state budget is going to encourage people to move west, and we'll give you money for building a cabin and starting a farm. And that was how they encouraged, and it's still a lot of, you know, cattle ranches and stuff like
Mm.
that. And I'd be willing to bet that less than 50%, probably less than 20% of Americans could pick out what each of those states are. Like
Sure.
they know it's, you know, it's Montana, but they couldn't tell you which one was which. So,
Mm. Well, I mean, to be fair, happily in the UK, we don't really have that kind of challenge because we're so small.
right.
But we do have counties, and I have to say, I'm not sure if I could name every county on the map. I think I could get the big ones, but I don't know if I could name every single one.
Well, so England is about the size of Illinois, where I live.
Mm.
And I definitely could not name all the counties in Illinois.
Mm.
I could name the ones that I could drive to in under 2 hours.
Oh yeah, yeah. You know the ones around you, right?
Yeah.
Like I know the ones I've lived in, which is helpful. You know, I can certainly chart because I was born down in the south of England in the county of Dorset. And I've slowly and surely, as my life has progressed, kind of moved further and further away from Dorset because I'm now up in Scotland. So I can kind of track my trajectory,
Yeah.
but if I have to go too far left or right, I'd get lost completely.
Okay, so the interesting stuff about how we learn and how we learn through stories.
Mm,
You talked a little bit earlier about your PhD work,
mm.
and I'd love to hear a little bit more about that and maybe what your thesis was about.
Yeah, so I mean, I've kind of been speaking, I guess, to it
Sure.
sort of throughout our conversation. So my thesis, well, you know what it's like when you do study. You sort of go in with one idea of what you're going to write about, and then you end up writing about something completely different. So I wanted to write about, initially, I wanted to write about whether or not different forms of publication are allowing for different narratives to come forward. So I was looking at traditional publication, I was looking at fan fiction, I was looking at independence publication. What I wanted to do was kind of discover, okay, well, we know that traditional publishing is I'm not going to say limited because that's not fair, but certainly traditional publishing has to be much more concerned about getting books onto the supermarket shelves, onto Waterstones, or what would it be in America, Barnes and Noble, Target, those kind of things, right? And that's the model. It's a strength and a limitation
Right.
in both. So there's no criticism here. Whereas then you obviously have fan fiction, which has always fulfilled a space where fans have felt that the story or the narrative could be twisted, could be turned, could be made LGBTQ, could be made male, could be made female, could be made black or brown or white or whatever. Like it's always been a site of transformation.
Mhm.
And then I wanted to look at indie publishing and self-publishing where there is no kind of gatekeeping process and to see, well, what are these people publishing? So
Right.
that's initially where the thesis started, because I wanted to see whether the representation of women was different or better or just changed,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
So because you can't just go how are women represented, because that's even for a PhD that's far too big. That's somebody's life's work. How are women represented? That's me as an 80-year-old woman still studying the subject. So I had to place some limitations on it in order to make it manageable. So those were the limitations that I placed. But through kind of studying that, through looking at, okay, so historically I looked at fairy tales and folklore and how women are represented in that. Then I followed those representations through medieval fantasy, so the Arthurian legends, things like that.
Mhm.
Followed it through to Tolkien, as arguably Tolkien set. In fact, I do argue this, so it is literally arguably. Tolkien set the kind of mode and the model for what an expectation of high fantasy should be. And he did that with the aid of the Ballantine adult fantasy series, which codified so much high fantasy in the sort of 50s to the mid 70s. Really, they had the monopoly on it. So what they said became what we expect high fantasy to look like. And then I moved on to George R. R. Martin. At the time, I did my PhD in like 2016, 2017. At that point, George R. R. Martin was the archetype of what high fantasy was at the time. The television series was the most watched television series. The books were the most sold high fantasy books. So he was the most obvious decision. I might, if I were writing it now, it would be really interesting because I might look as well at kind of romantasy fiction, which has really come through in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, but it wasn't really there when I wrote my PhD. So that was what I went in with. I was like, I'm going to chart how women are representative, what they look like, what they do, how they behave, what they're allowed to do. And I'm going to chart it from almost from pre-literature, from folkloring, from oral story traditions through to kind of Grimm and when stories were starting to get written down, through medieval fantasy, through Tolkien, through the Baths in the 70s, up to George R. R. Martin. And in doing that, I obviously had to legitimize why does this representation matter? Like, fine, you want to do this kind of historical mapping, if you like, but why should anybody care about the way women are presented? Why does it matter if women are presented this way or that way? And so obviously I had to justify my research aims. And that's when I started learning about the things that I've been talking about. So things like the sleeper effect, things like the just world belief, things like monomyths and symptomatic structures, mythemes and anthropomorphization and fascinating. I mean, I could bore you and your listeners for hours and hours on this subject. I've barely even scratched the surface of how frightening it can get.
Wow.
Which it really is. I mean, I loved it. I like being scared. As I said, I like the brain. So I like what the brain can do that's amazing, and I'm fascinated by what the brain can do that's terrifying.
Sure.
But yeah, honestly, I could bang on about this for a long time. You have to stop me.
Well, we'll have to take it offline and
Yes.
another conversation about that. Okay, so if people are looking for your books, where can they find them?
Oh, you can find them. Well, if you want to read an ebook, you can find them on Kindle Unlimited. So you can read them for free if you have Kindle Unlimited. Otherwise, they're on Amazon. They're not currently on Apple or Google Play, but I am about to upload them. I'm just having a little bit of trouble with my Apple computer at the moment. It seems to have died. So as soon as I can get my hands on a working Apple computer, then I'll upload them onto Apple and Google. So ebook, Amazon, and soon to be Apple, Google, Kobo, everywhere else, but currently just Amazon. Paperbacks, where are you? You're America. So you can get them on Amazon again, Barnes and Noble. They should be available in Target. If they're not, you can ask Target to order it in for you. And you can get them from your library. If your library doesn't have them, then just ask your library to get a copy, which I really promote. I think, every time somebody says to me, "Oh, I found your book in the library," it really brings a song to my heart because libraries are so wonderful. They're also available in audiobook. They are read by the extraordinarily talented Ely Beaton, absolutely phenomenal actor and performer. I'm hybrid published, so my novels are self-published, but the audiobooks are traditionally published. And my publisher got Ely Beaton for me, and I've never been more grateful in my life. She's so fab. And the audiobooks are available everywhere: Spotify, Amazon, Apple, Google, wherever you get your audiobooks from, you can get audiobooks. I think that's it. That's quite a laundry list of availability. I'm everywhere basically. I should be relatively easy for you to find
Great.
if you wish.
Okay, so before we wrap it up entirely, do you have any final thoughts for my listeners?
I would like to say I do actually. It's quite cute. So I apologize if this is going to get very, saccharine and sickly sweet. But I'd never come across the idea of folklore as something you can do, as in to folklore,
Yeah.
until I met Tracy, until I started listening to these podcasts. And it's genuinely, actually, as I say, this is going to sound really soppy and really saccharine, and people are going to be throwing up now. But it's really given me a really happy perspective on things. This idea that I can go out and as I say, I went to visit the witch, and I don't think I'd have done that normally. But because I was thinking, what can I folklore today? What's a nice thing that is in touch with the world and in touch with nature and in touch with my hands and my body? And I thought, well, what can I do? And I'm no chef. If I made shortbread, it would have 25 sticks of butter in it. Do you know what I mean? It would be a disaster. So I went to visit the witch, and I guess that's what I would say to your readers. If you've been listening to this podcast and hearing Tracy and her guests sort of say, "Oh, I did this piece of folkloring today," and you haven't yet had a go yourself, I really recommend having a go yourself because it's genuinely really refreshing.
Oh, that makes me so happy to hear.
Yeah, I'm pleased. Like I said, people are probably going to think now that you put me up to saying that, but genuinely, it wasn't put up to saying that at all.
Yeah, no, I tell all of my people that I interview that I'm going to ask that question, but I don't ask what the answer is beforehand. I just wait and see. And I was kind of hoping for Ghost Cat, but
Oh, yeah, ghost cat. Well, that's the other piece of advice then. If you can get a ghost cat, get yourself a ghost cat because they're very companionable animals. We have a ghost cat in our house.
but yeah, it's always a great fun for me to explain to people what it is and then hear what they've taken into their life to do, because that's the point of folkloring, is to get folklore into your life, even if it's only symbolism or whatever it
Hmm.
is. But yeah, and like you
It's very calming. Or at least my interpretation of it is something. It's very calming and it's very centering, and I really like it.
said, good. I'm glad to hear it. Well, thank you again for taking the time. This was great, and
Thank you so much for having me.
thanks everybody listening. As always, thanks for listening to Folkloring. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a rating and review, and don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or comments or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Facebook or Instagram. Other places you can find me are at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent, or creating folklore-inspired games at madmenandheroes.com. Stay curious, stay connected, and keep the traditions alive. And I hope that wherever you are, folklore is making your life more magical.